Are you hiding parts of yourself at work? If so, you are not alone. Many of us, particularly women of color, don't feel safe enough to share our true selves at work, which takes a toll on us physically and emotionally. This week, I talk with Tricia Montalvo Timm, author of the book Embrace the Power of You, Owning Your Identity at Work. Tricia shares very vulnerably the story of how, in her quest to assimilate and blend in at work, she found herself denying important parts of herself. Here, we talk about the ways in which so many of us feel pressured to downplay our authentic selves, what we can do to embrace our true selves, and how we can create more inclusive workplaces so that we all feel less pressure to hide what makes us special. Thank you so much, as always, for listening. Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Tricia. I know I said this to you before I hit record, but I'm going to say it again too. I'm so excited to meet you and to have this conversation. I would love to start by inviting you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Kim. I'm so excited to be here and have this amazing conversation. So a little bit about me professionally. I have been working in Silicon Valley for over 25 years, working with mostly high-tech companies, from small startups to large global multinational companies. And I'm a corporate lawyer by training. And my last operational role was as general counsel and executive sponsor of diversity, equity, and inclusion at Looker, which was a data analytics company that we sold to Google in 2020 in one of their largest transactions, $2.6 billion. It was their fourth largest transaction. From there, I decided to pivot in my career, and now I have a portfolio career. So I serve on a corporate board of directors of a company called Salsify. And I'm the chair of their comp committee, member of their audit committee there, serve on a few nonprofit boards as well. And then I wrote this book, Embrace the Power of You, Owning Your Identity at Work, which we just published in March, and speaking about that right now into organizations and companies. So that's a little bit about my professional background. If it's okay, I'd love to spend a minute or two on my personal background, because I think that gives a little context to all of this. I am a first-generation Latina. My father is from Ecuador. My mother is from El Salvador. They immigrated to this country and met in LA. And I was born in Los Angeles, California. And we lived in Los Angeles until I was about 6 years old. And my parents, as immigrants, had thick Spanish accents. And unfortunately, they were discriminated against. And like, most immigrants, they really wanted the American dream for their family. And they wanted us to struggle less than they were struggling. So they moved us out of the city into an accompanying suburb, where I all of a sudden found myself as the only Latina in a predominantly white community. And out of love, they really thought it would be better if people didn't know where I was from, if I assimilated, if I just blended into the crowd, that I would have an easier path. And in some respects, they were right. Unfortunately, we do have a lot of bias in the workplace. So I think it helped me in some ways, but it takes an emotional toll after a while, really, not showing up authentically as who you are, downplaying your ethnicity. And I also found I wasn't alone as I was writing my book. 76% of Latinos downplay or hide their ethnicity at the workplace. So yeah, 76%. So it's a high number. So I'm not alone on this. And as I've been telling my stories, many have come to me and shared that they're doing the same thing. So that's a little bit about my background.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And this is really, I think, an important conversation when you talk about hiding a part of yourself or downplaying a part of yourself. That has to take a toll on you, right? Like you feel like you're keeping this secret and then you're not being able to be true to yourself. And so what is the effect of that?
It's interesting. So for me, I started doing it at a young age that I didn't even intentionally, consciously know I was doing that as an adult. It sort of became who I was. And so when I was, so I was, growing up outside of LA, and I tell the story in the book, and I think it explains a little bit of like why I was hiding. I did a little bit of acting. We lived near Hollywood. And so I had an agent and I was doing all the things, and I got a photo, a photo shoot and had the whole thing. And my original photo had my name, Tricia Montalvo. And when I was going out on auditions, I was getting all the Spanish speaking parts, or I was being asked to audition for Spanish speaking parts, but not English speaking mainstream parts. And so my agent said, we are having a problem. You're not getting, asked to come to these auditions for the mainstream parts, which are the more, the better ones. And they said, well, you need to change your name, and your name needs to be more American. And so I was like, well, I am American. I was born here. I speak English, I go to school. Like, what does being more American mean? And so they changed my photo, and I changed my name, and I became Patricia McLean. And so my last name changed. And with that, I started learning that there's something wrong with being Latino. There was something that was going to harm me for being Latino, that I wasn't American enough. And so I started at such an early age that I will do better, be better as being more, white passing. And so because I had done it for so long, I didn't even recognize. So for me, it was a process of self-reflection, because I had done it for 20 years, and really recognizing why I was doing this. Why didn't I embrace my culture? Why wasn't I proudly talking about it? Why wasn't I sharing it with my children? And it becomes exhausting. It becomes physically exhausting. I straightened my hair for decades because I thought that was more professional looking than my curly hair. I sort of muted my voice. I have a loud laugh. I'm just kind of a louder person. But I didn't want to be the loud Latina in the room. So I just changed all these parts of myself, and which is very common for women of color. They change a lot of parts of themselves to fit in to the mainstream or whatever the dominant culture is. And, when I'm in those spaces, particularly with women of color, they'll say to me, it's not until I get home that I can just relax, I can finally be myself. And so imagine spending all day, every day, gearing up for the day and changing the hair and the clothes and your mannerisms and your language, and not being able to bring your full ideas and innovation and creativity to the room because you're so bogged down by this other piece of you. It's a lot.
Absolutely. And especially if there's any amount of shame attached to your identity, because it's the energy that you're describing to have to adopt this totally different persona that you think is more aligned with the cultural mainstream, and then to worry I hope I don't slip up, right? Or then people are going to find me out. And I think a lot about, just sort of the connection to imposter syndrome and this feeling of I'm not good enough. People are going to find out. And so it makes so much sense that people who feel different from the dominant culture would be more likely to experience that, because what you're describing is essentially, and I know that this is reality, right? Is that there is this mindset societally that there's a certain profile that we should all strive to fit. And that if you deviate from that in any way, it's not you have this unique differentiated identity. It's no, I need to contort myself in some way to fit this very limited profile. And if I don't feel like I do, then I start to doubt myself. Then I start to hide the parts of myself that would likely be an asset to other people if I could share them.
Yes. I mean, I'm glad you said that. Yes. Like, I think that the parts that we're hiding from the workplace are assets. And that's really the message of my book at the end. It's like really coming to, belong, and belonging begins with self-acceptance. And once you believe that what you bring to the world is valuable and is an asset, that's when you free yourself and really bring and contribute into the workplace. And another example of how I sort of downplayed or hid parts of me was being a working mom. When I had my first daughter, I was in a all male leadership team. It was not an inclusive environment. And there were no, this was 20 years ago, dating myself, but there were no ERGs. There was no diversity, equity, inclusion programs. There were not even any external women organizations. So me showing up, pregnant in a really unsupportive space was like, how do I do this? There was no playbook. How do I, raising a family mattered to me. I wanted to do that, but I also really deeply cared about my career. And I was right at that stage that many women have, like right when you're about to get the next big job is kind of the time when you're starting a family. And how do you reconcile the two? So when I announced that I was pregnant, my boss, his reaction was, how could you do this to me? I've seen this movie. I know how it ends. And I had the same reaction you had, but at the same time, I was the sole breadwinner. And I wanted to prove that this movie would not end differently, that I would come back and I would prove that I deserve my position, that I deserve the next promotion, that I deserve all the things. And so I came back really hiding this part of my identity as well. And so much so that, my daughter, when I went back to work, my daughter wouldn't take the bottle. So I had to nurse her for about a month. And my husband would follow me, every meeting I went to, be in the garage. There were no nursing rooms. I would go to the parking garage and nurse my baby in the car and do all of these things because I didn't want to, I wanted to show up the way everybody else is showing up, which was one way. And that was not with a baby, nursing, taking breaks, pumping, like all of that made me different. And I had a lot of fear that I would be looked down upon for that reason. And so the tragedy of that is that we have working moms in the workplace. We all contribute so much. And, by not creating an inclusive environment for me, I really got disconnected, frustrated, angry. Like it was a place where I eventually needed to leave. But it's so important that we have that perspective in the workplace so that we can create better working environments for our working parents, because, we need to have those perspectives in the room.
You're so right. And I'm just, oh gosh, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about the horror of having to go through that experience. And if you can't hide being pregnant, right? Like it's one thing you can.
I hid as long as I could. I think I told him when I was like 6.5 months pregnant. I wore a lot of big clothes.
Oh my gosh. And I just think about it too, of like, obviously this is not how people think, but I'm like, you're breeding the next generation of the workplace. Totally. Like somebody has to give birth to these people.
Right. Who's going to do this? Yes, I know. Oh, but that experience, and people are like, I can't, how horrible. And it was probably one of the hardest times of my career. But everything happens for a reason. And, I think going through that journey for me, as tough as it was, 20 years later, whenever it was, but 15 years later, when I was then a leader at Looker and part of the executive team, I remember walking into the office one day and seeing a woman pregnant. And she was one of the first women that was pregnant while working at Looker. And I thought, this has to be different for her. She cannot go through the same experience that I went through. And it was the reason that I came forward and said, look, we need to start a DEI program. because we need to create spaces for working moms here in this organization. And so, I think that we need to role model what it's like to be, I think role modeling authenticity allows and gives permission to others within the organization to show up as their authentic selves. And I think it's important that we support that.
That's such a great point, because one of the things that we're talking about when we talk about the conformity tendency or drive is that we end up perpetuating a system that doesn't work for most of us.
Yeah.
And this individual experience that you're describing of just constant fear that you're going to do it wrong, that people are going to find you out. And so I think the ultimate hope is that as more women, as more people of color, as people who have different identities start to rise through the ranks, that they break that cycle of conformity so that they can create a new reality for the people who are coming up behind them, right? And that's not an easy role to play. So how did you navigate? I mean, I guess I'm curious, it sounds like you got a positive response to the proposal that we need to have this initiative, but how did it feel to be a trailblazer in that way? Like, did it feel risky to you? Do you feel like it was something that was really uncomfortable?
Yeah. So, two things. So before that moment, I had already sort of started on my own healing and my own transformation. So for a couple of years prior to that moment, I was working on myself, unpacking all the, baggage and harm and trauma that had happened over the couple of decades of my career. So I had by that point really done a lot of that work of healing and finding the tools and support that I need when I, face it now. So I was in a better spot to, be able to sustain if the answer was no, or if there was pushback or challenges. Then I would say, a couple of years prior. But even with that being said, we started the DEI program my impetus was, to support working moms, because that was a place that I couldn't really hide too much. I had children at that point; they were teenagers, and I was talking about them. So, being a working mom, and at that point, there was so much conversation about supporting our working moms, it felt less risky. But what happened was, we created this DI program, and of course, a number of different ERGs emerged, one of them being the Latinx ERG. And we also created a storyteller program. And if you wouldn't believe it, they asked me to come tell my story during National Hispanic Heritage Month. And I remember when they tapped me for this, I thought, never told my story in the workplace. That was risky for me, because I had not done that. And so I had a lot of trepidation going into that, a lot of fear. And it took me a lot of courage to go in, because I didn't know what the reaction would be, and all of my fears that I'd created over the years. And they were real. I mean, I had sat in rooms where people used all sorts of, derogatory comments and whatnot. So I had real fears. But I decided to do it. And so I went up and I told my story for the first time in front of my colleagues at Looker and globally. And what I didn't realize was the impact that story would have on others. I was so concerned about me getting over it and getting through it and building up the courage and having all my fears. But I didn't realize the value of the storytelling. And so when I finished the story, I had so many people come up to me, just say, I didn't know, I opened my eyes. I didn't know this about you. I didn't know that other people are the struggle with this. How beautiful your culture is. I'd like to learn more. And then the most rewarding was Latinas, young Latinas especially, say, I've never seen anyone that looks like me in leadership. The first time I've literally seen it. Or my mother also is from El Salvador. I've never met anybody whose mother's from El Salvador. I feel like I can do it. I feel seen. Your story is my story. And that moment for me was all I needed to say, okay, this sharing this part of me is not about me. It's about everyone else. It provides permission for others to show up. One of the things I struggled with as a young Latina 25 years ago was I saw nobody that looked like me. So I couldn't imagine myself being in these positions. They seemed so foreign to me. And by me not showing up as a Latina and proud, what a disservice to this next generation, because they're so desperately looking for that. And Latinas, I mean, we're less than 2% in the C-suite, less than 1% in the boardroom. They really are very few of us. So I feel like it almost was a responsibility to be seen.
Oh, what a powerful story. I had goosebumps while you were saying that about the
Yeah.
responsibility. Because you're right. And I think that it is so hard. I mean, it is really hard to share vulnerably and openly, especially a story you haven't told before. And
Yeah.
and I just think about this in terms of people listening who may be very guarded for very legitimate reasons, but to think about opportunities for vulnerability as not, obviously we're all going to have our own fears like you're talking about, but to think of them as an act of service, right? Because I think that so often we are willing to take that risk if we feel like we're doing it on a mission, if we're doing it for the benefit of others. And so everybody wins when you do that, because I'm sure there's a certain amount of healing that came with that process for you too. And then to be able to provide that kind of support to others is so powerful.
It's been the most rewarding part of writing the book and speaking to people. I get emails and notes from folks just really grateful to be in conversation even around this topic. There is a lot of shame. If you've been hiding something about yourself, there's a lot of shame of revealing it. And so openly talking about that is really important. And so, I've definitely been rewarding.
Do you have tips for, obviously it sounds like you had a very specific event that you were invited to in order to tell your story. Are there other ways in which you would recommend people think about sharing a little bit more of themselves in the workplace and, maybe taking baby steps if it feels too daunting to do something on a stage? Well,
yeah. And Kim, I think what you said just now is an important part is baby steps. And one of the messages I have in my book is called small steps repeated often. And they are baby steps. They're small steps. You're not going to just go on a platform and tell your whole story for the first time. And that would be really hard. And for me, I didn't start there. I started with baby steps. I started with sharing a little bit about myself to my friends my friends didn't know my background, and talking about my family in Ecuador and how many cousins I had and how, what the family trips were like there and what the country was like, and just in a really safe environment with people that I trusted, and then moved on from that to starting to slowly reveal myself on public spaces where I would maybe like on LinkedIn, I would add things about my heritage, being part of the Hispanic National Bar Association, adding Spanish as a language that I speak, and just sort of revealing more of who I am in a public space. And also even in social media, just making some comments in Spanish, or talking about my relatives or things like that, just very subtly just start talking about, the things that are important to you or that are part of you that you may not have otherwise talked about. So that's how I started it, with little baby steps. And once you it's like a muscle. Once you practice doing some of that and you realize the world doesn't fall apart, and you do it again, it becomes a little bit easier each time.
I think that's such a great way to think about it. I often say that too, of like your brain catches up once you do it, and the sky doesn't fall, right? It's like, it's not as dangerous or scary as I thought it was. I can do it more easily the next time. So
yeah.
That's great. And then in terms of, and this one's probably a little bit trickier because there's so much that depends on the culture of the organization that you belong to. But as sort of the next level of what we're talking about, do you have thoughts on how to influence change, how to be a change maker from the inside? It's hard to, it's got to be hard to propose something that doesn't exist today and worry what people are going to think. Like, how do you apply a similar principle of baby steps, but to try to move the ball forward as it relates to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think if you are that person on that journey, I think just showing up as yourself, as wholly and authentically as you are, is change maker. You are a change maker, right? Because you are already influencing everyone around you. And part of this conversation is really, why I'm such a proponent of storytelling, of telling our stories to each other, is that all of those fears or stories or unconscious biases that we've created, start going by the wayside because you just get to know each other. So I think just really showing up authentically is, a really big part of this. If you're a manager or leader, and if you do have a sense of belonging and you have influence, there are so many strategies that I've included in the book of how you can create change within your organization. And so, like, for example, if you are holding a meeting, and oftentimes, as organizations, we always are striving to have more diversity, right? The stats look really good. You want them to look good. But then once somebody gets there, you don't do anything around creating a safe space for inclusion. And so you'll have a meeting and you'll say, I want diverse thought. But then you'll say, well, I don't know, why are you always, saying the opposite thing? Or why are you, why can't you just go along with what we're all agreeing on? So if you're holding a meeting, instead of requiring that one person to be always raising their hand with the maybe opposite opinion, you can challenge the group. If you see the conversation kind of landing with everyone, coming around with one idea, challenge the group to say, hey, I want the group now to think opposite. What is the opposite of the situation here? What is something outside of the box? What is a different way to approach it? So now you're challenging the whole group to come up with a different idea rather than singling out one person who may always have a unique idea. So that doesn't other them as much. So, that's a simple technique that managers can do just to create more inclusion and more diversity of thought into decision making.
I love that because I think that there are a lot of well-intentioned leaders who would love to create more inclusive spaces, but there's a gap between the vision and the action, right? And so it's like, what does that actually mean? Especially if, not to excuse, bad behavior, but I think there are a lot of people who are just running 100 miles an hour trying to meet all of the deadlines and pressure points, and they just don't give themselves space to even think differently about how they're behaving. So much of it is habitual and reflexive, and they don't realize what they're doing or the impact it's having. So being able to not only think about what would it look like, but to have very actionable steps that they could take.
Yes. Well, and inclusion has to be intentional, as you mentioned. We are all busy, and there's going to be a million reasons why, so hiring. Well, the pipeline, it's hard to find diverse candidates, or that you don't have budget for this. I mean, there's a million reasons of why you might not want to work on it, and it has to be intentional. It has to be intentional from the strategic level. At the manager level, people really have to make it something that they are working on. And the other piece of inclusive leadership is getting comfortable being uncomfortable. These conversations are hard sometimes, and we all come to this conversation from a different lived experience, and it might make us uncomfortable. We don't want to get it wrong. A lot of times people say nothing or do nothing because they don't want to make a mistake. And so, I think, I'll often, the benefit of being able to be both white passing and a person of color is I'm in both spaces. And so I'm very, when I'm in the space of women of color, I'll hear that we're very used to being uncomfortable. We have had to learn how to be uncomfortable to survive in this life. So being uncomfortable is not a hard thing for us. But when when I'm in spaces or when I challenge somebody who may not be used to being uncomfortable, that feeling of being uncomfortable really is hard. And so you want to shut down. You don't want to talk about it. Let's make it easy. Let's make everything, safe. And it's like, well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why we're feeling uncomfortable. Why, we're not going to make a change unless we get comfortable with that.
I'm so glad you brought this up too, because I was thinking about the responsibility of people, let's face it, white men, white people, right, to be part of this. It's not, we certainly shouldn't put the burden on people of color or, anybody who sort of feels different from the dominant culture. But you're absolutely right that there's so many people, and I've heard this from very brave white men who have said to me before, like, I don't know what support looks like. I'm so afraid of getting it wrong. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to do the wrong thing. And so in particular, as we talk about creating space for people to be their authentic selves, to share their stories, to talk about their own, sort of family origin, heritage, all of these aspects of ourselves, are there ways in which you think people could invite others to share more of that? Because you don't want to infringe on someone's privacy or make them feel different in some way. But also sometimes if we don't create an opportunity for the conversation, nobody knows that it's okay to have it, or nobody feels like it's safe to do. So how do we model a safe place for people to be themselves? I know that's a big question, but just any thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think, I really do believe in the power of vulnerability. So I think the leaders that are vulnerable about their lives creates a safe, psychologically safe place for people to bring their whole lives to work. So it doesn't have to be about race or gender. It could be, I'm really struggling with anxiety, or I'm having a hard time. I have a elderly family member that I'm caring for. My child is going through these hard times. Like when people start sharing the hard things, what they're struggling with, then it creates a space where, I'm also struggling with this, or this has been hard for me. So I think vulnerability, I think we're not one-dimensional people, we're multi-dimensional people. And the more connection you can make on the human side with people around you that work with you, the more they're going to bring their whole selves to work. So I think vulnerability is a place to start.
That's a really good point too, because I've been thinking a lot lately about expanding the definition of diversity to, I think one of the unintended consequences of some of the DEI initiatives has been to create somewhat of an us versus them type of dynamic. And I think sometimes some people feel like they don't see themselves as diverse, as if there's like, one thing and then everybody else is diverse, right? No, it's all of us, right? And so I think too, one of the things that I will say is, even if we don't know what it feels like to be part of an underrepresented group, we all know what it feels like to feel left out. We all know what it feels like to feel like an outsider in some way, right? And so I actually, I was doing a group around like confidence building. And there was this very senior level white man who participated in the group. And he talked about the fact that he grew up in rural Idaho. It was the only one in his community to go to college. He moved to like the East Coast. And now he has this very difficult time relating back to his community. And I just thought it was a perfect example of how we can see ourselves in this conversation, no matter what our background is. And so I think getting people to really think about, like you're talking about, sharing the hard stuff. We've all, we've all had unique experiences, but there's a lot of common themes. So
yes. And I try to emphasize that when I have this conversation. I mean, there's so many parts of ourselves. You just mentioned economic, background. Neurodiversity is another one. My daughter has dyslexia. A lot of people don't talk about their dyslexia, but we need to talk about it, right? There's different learning styles. How do we bring the best out of people unless we talk about learning differences? There's so many different parts of being raised by a foster parent, being homeless for part of your life. There's just getting a GED instead of a college degree. There's just so many parts of ourselves that we say, oh, it's not going to be good enough, so I'm going to not talk about it. Yeah. But we all have things in our backgrounds that were maybe hard or challenging, but that is what society is. And how do we create products and services that serve all communities unless we're talking about those things?
Exactly. And so I think there's so many different reasons for doing what we're talking about. Any surprises for you as you were writing the book? Anything that you weren't expecting to hear, or?
Oh, that's a great question. The surprise for me was how much marketing, how much visibility I needed to, when I'm a lawyer, so the writing piece wasn't that hard in the sense of I'm used to writing. I'm really used to editing. So the editing process often is hard for authors. Not hard for me. I redline everything all day long. So the writing, even though I definitely hit points that were challenging of imposter syndrome, thinking of myself as an author, but the visibility piece was really hard. I really struggled with creating a platform, creating visibility around me. It felt very, very selfish, or very a lot of ego involved in it. And I didn't like that piece of it. So for example, when I was trying to come up with a cover design, the publisher recommended that I put a picture of myself on the book. And my first thought was, the first book that came to my mind was Michelle Obama's Becoming. And I was like, I am no Michelle Obama. Why would I in the world would I put my picture on this book? How? I couldn't even think about it. I mean, it was an automatic no. There's no way. Just the vulnerability of putting my picture on thousands of books, I could not get my head around it. And as you know, I didn't do it. But what they were trying to say to me was, look, your whole message and mission is to inspire others. It's to be visible especially for Latinas. They don't see themselves in leadership. So by putting your face out there, it's not about you. It's about them. It's about how do you inspire them? People have to have a face to be inspired by. And so we compromised, and I have a little tiny picture right here. But I've become more comfortable with it, and I have made a website and doing more social, and it matters. It does matter. But that was a really hard. I struggled with it. I kind of said no a million times, and I'm getting around to it now.
Well, I am so grateful to you for sharing your story here, for sharing your story in the book. Where can people find you if they want to learn more, to get your book?
Yeah. Well, I have a website, TriciaTimm.com. So TriciaTimm.com. You can join my newsletter there, and you can find my book everywhere. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your indie bookstore. It's on audiobook, Kindle, all the places you can find it.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Tricia. I am so grateful to you for this conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having conversations like this. They're so important. So thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open regardless of gender
To anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.